Good afternoon, everybody. We've got a lot of things to talk about tonight. We'd like to start by thanking everybody for supporting us and everything that we've been doing over the last couple of months on both channels. It's been a great time. We've been getting a lot of people in here, and we've been appreciating every single bit of it. All right, so we've got Eric Quest back on the show. How's it going?
Alright, how's it going? Hopefully you guys are happy to have me back.
Went all right the first time, so let's go ahead and talk about some things that have been happening over the last couple of weeks. All right, so we've been analyzing and diving into the Indiana Bigfoot Research Project that Eric had been doing. And in the process of doing that, we've come across multiple different things that are really interesting that we want to share with everybody tonight. However, before we do that, we want to bring up something else that we came across just in the last 24 hours, okay? So, over on Reddit, there was a copycat post about the Indiana Bigfoot Mapping Project, which is the exact same name as the thing that is going on here that you guys had seen in this previous video that we'll put up here on the screen, okay? So, I thought that was a little sketchy, so I got into it. Well, it turns out we don't believe that this mapping project that we got going on here is entirely legit, okay? There's multiple things. We're not going to go into 100% all of them unless you want that in a separate video, which if you do, go ahead and put that down below. But to bring it up, most of the links don't work. Some of these are way too descriptive to be considered a scientific-based database. It kind of looks like they were kind of letting anything in, but at the same time, it was referencing actual reports without listing the citation that was clearly visible. Alright, one of which being one of the reports that is unique to Eric Quest's database. Okay, so before we get into the show, we want to bring in the fact that, yeah, anybody nowadays with the power of AI can spend about 10 to 15 minutes to make something that looks just as dynamic as what took the man sitting across from me on the internet a good 8 months of his life doing, okay? For either person or anybody out there that actually sat down and looked at both of these things, is that you could see the quality in the original versus the knockoff. And gosh, it just really sucks to see the water muddied continuously by crappy reporting or by bad information or just somebody wanting to get more views on a social media platform. We really need to stand up as a community and try and get more people on the conversation that's willing to speak about it rationally, but really not try to sell you a load of, well, the stuff that you can get over in the back of Feeder Supply, right? We just wanted to warn you guys about potential misinformation out there online. And let's go ahead and get into tonight's conversation. Alright, so Eric, we've got a lot to talk about with the analysis of the database, okay? Now, when it comes to all of the different things that you were able to glean off of the database itself and make some charts that we're going to actually put up on here as we're going over them, I'm going to let you pick which one you kind of want to go over first and why you feel like that was interesting compared to other Bigfoot research that we have out here and that is published.
I was actually kind of wanting to go over something else to begin with.
Okay.
So, there's been 5 LEOs and 2 biologists I've been able to find while doing this research. So I figured that would be maybe a good place to start, just to show how credible some of these witnesses are.
Yeah.
So I was able to get in contact with a biologist I messaged in the last podcast that I did, or podcast, whatever it's called. He had a sighting in Kentucky. He actually never had an encounter in Indiana, I don't think. I guess I did send you the text there. I guess you could put that on the video as well. But yeah, he seems really credible.
I don't know if I want to dox the guy. You know what I mean?
I hit everything, so I don't think it'll be a concern.
Okay. We'll throw it up there then if you feel like we're good. I just, some people, especially people that are mandated reporters, don't want to ruin
Yeah, I
their
would never.
career. But the point does stand. I don't want to interrupt. I apologize. That one was a little rough. But like I said, didn't want to potentially dox the guy.
Yeah. So he's a like a herpetologist, actually. Yeah, I don't want to reveal too much about him, just because I don't want to have anybody figure out who he is. But yeah, it's pretty cool having a biologist who actually has came forward with a sighting, and then so there's like 5 LEOs. I thought there was 4, but there was another one that contacted the BFRO, so that makes 5. And there's actually probably like closer to 12 or 10 LEOs whenever you include like people that have called 911 after reports as well. The LEOs that I have are there's one from Spencer County, there's one from Monroe County, there's one from Steuben County, then there's 2 that were from Northeast Indiana that work together. So that's pretty cool. You could see this all on the map. So some of the other examples of people that called 911 after sightings were this guy from Jasonville possibly had a sighting, and there was one from Paoli where there was a sighting, and then there was another one where a sheriff came over and so like supposedly a Sasquatch actually attacked a person's car. I don't know. Like some of these claims are kind of weird, but like the cop came over and was like, yeah, you guys just attacked your own car with a sledgehammer. So that sounds pretty ridiculous. I think that's like about as elaborate as a Bigfoot attacking somebody's car. Yeah, there's a lot of credible people here, and that's like one of the biggest things for me. But yeah, we could go ahead and get the data if you want to.
All right. So now that we know that the people that are here aren't just the regular average Joes, that the database itself also has a number of mandated reporters within its ranks to kind of back up the validity of what's being said here, let's go ahead and get into what this database actually says. Okay, so let's just go ahead and bring up the colors really quick because I think this one was actually pretty interesting to me. Because whenever you think about Bigfoot, most people think about Patty, right? And Patty was famously brown in color, right? However, what we've got here in Indiana paints a little bit different of a story. I'll go ahead and let you take over, okay?
So like whenever you picture Bigfoot, you definitely picture like brown hair. So like there's the Patterson Gimlin film, of course, but of course you also have Harry and the Hendersons, like Jack Lynx. They all have brown hair, so you would expect all sightings to have like brown hair if it were like a hoax, right? Well, actually 50% of sightings have black hair. Brown is actually like this is the second most type of color reported, but it's still like very limited in the amount of reports that are brown. So I just think it's so weird that like since most media depictions depict like a brown hair color, it would be really weird that it's just really weird that they're all black. Sorry, kind of messing up on my wording here. My bad.
Well, I think that the other thing that's really kind of cool here out of this pie chart is that it does have the species variation that you would think of when you think of primates, right? You've got all of the natural ones that you would see across multiple different species, right? Ourselves included in our own hair color. But
Yeah.
the one thing I do find kind of cool is that really aside from red hair being another kind of outlier, gray and white hair, which is what something you would associate with kind of age, I would imagine, especially if the red-haired ones are getting old, they're going to go white. They're not going to go gray. Like, my hair is going white. My hair's not going gray. You know what I'm saying? So, if you've got one that's got any age to it, it's going to be either gray-haired or white-haired. There's some, allegedly, like the Alabama white thing, or old yellow top, that has blonde or white hair. But you're seeing things that denote age progression in a community, and that also mirrors a biological entity, which is something that you want to continually establish whenever you're talking about establishing a creature's validity, right? You want to say, hey, not only is there a basis for species having a community or a population of some amount of density, but you also want to say, hey, it's also a primate. And one thing that we can see amongst other primates is that there are either multiple different types of colors, or you've got dimorphism, where there's either two different types of colors. Now, there's also, chimpanzees that are generally one color, but for the most part, the entire great ape species is known for having a good amount of color variation. However, I do want to say, too, it is pretty interesting to me that, at least here in Indiana, the species variation seems to lean more towards black, which might be more of a adaptation towards nocturnal behavior. It would be a lot easier in order to camouflage yourself. If your fur was black instead of white or brown or red, it would be a lot easier to run around at night. Now, the other thing that I want to bring up really quick, let's lead into the next one here, is that the height distribution for it is also a little different than what we would normally think of when we're thinking about Bigfoot, right?
Yeah. So I think according to Moneymaker, the average height's like 7'10". But here I've gathered all the heights, and the average height seems to be 7'6". And there's only like a 10 that are actually above, like 10 reports that are above like 8 feet, or wait, no, 10 that are above 9 feet. So like the creature does seem to be a lot smaller down here than it is like reported in other places.
No, and that lines up with Bergman's rule, right? Which is something that really states here that if you've got a species that's a part of multiple parts of a hemisphere, right? Like you've got equatorial versions and you've got Arctic versions. That means that the ones that are closer to the north are going to be bigger because they have to conserve more heat. The ones that are closer to the equator are going to be smaller because they don't have to. It actually would weigh them down, so they're smaller in order to disperse more heat more rapidly. The other thing that I found kind of interesting too is that there's a real big dip where like 9 feet seems to be the majority of tall Bigfoot reports. And one thing I want to throw up here, whenever we went down to Gatlinburg a couple of weeks ago, is we actually went to the Ripley's Museum and we saw the exhibit of the world's tallest man, and they had a replica of how big he was. 9 feet is huge. Like, a lot bigger than most people would imagine. So, it is kind of something to me where I know a lot of people probably couldn't wrap their head around what 9 feet actually looks like, because to most people, an NBA player like Shaq or any of these other really tall guys that are running around nowadays, they would be Bigfoot size to most people. And like, yeah, they kind of are. To be fair, a lot of these guys are in the 7 foot tall range, like high 6 feet, mid 7 feet tall. And that's kind of the average here, is that we've got a 7.5, kind of leaning on 8 foot tall average for Bigfoot sightings here in Indiana.
Yeah, I'd say this size seems totally, or like at least a lot more reasonable than like the 12-foot tall reports. So of course there are swine and black bears that get above 800 pounds, and it seems like 7.5 feet would kind of be in that range too. So we already have omnivorous animals of that size, so it's kind of less insane to picture something of like 7.5 feet a lot around surviving. So
it is kind of feasible for people in Indiana to have a misidentification of a black bear, because those aren't that normal around there. People in Kentucky have seen black bears. That's indigenous. It's been around here for a while. But black bears were pushed out of Indiana years and years and years ago, and now they're slowly getting their way back in. However, there are a lot of things with these reports that kind of eliminate bears being a misidentification and more of them having an actual sighting of some sort. It backs up the fact that if you've got a species that's indigenous to the United States and Canada and Alaska, that the ones that are in Alaska are going to be taller on average than the ones that are in Indiana. And that's what we've got here. Because I'm having a hard time off the top of my head what the average Bigfoot report in Alaska is. I think it's in between 9 and 11 feet tall. But those things are big up there. And it's consistent. And it's the same way with Canada. So it makes sense that if you've got a species living farther south, it would also be shorter. What do we got on the time for the sightings themselves?
Around 60% take place after dark, and I think 15% are like crepuscular, and the other 30% are during the day. This definitely lines up with what everybody else has said, obviously. So I was always kind of like questioning whether like Sasquatch is truly nocturnal. I mean, I guess it makes sense because they're said to have like large round eyes, just like owls and stuff like that. So it makes sense that they would be nocturnal. But just to further cement it, this like proves that. I find it really weird that like so many sightings are reported after dark, because you would expect like more of them to be reported during the day if this was all a hoax. Like with I've heard, I don't believe in Dogman at all. These are all like reported during the day for some reason, but here most of them are reported during the night. So that just adds a lot of value to these stories I've heard.
One thing I do want to bring up is that how much do you know about primate behavior? Are you aware that there was a tribe of monkeys, like I believe it was chimpanzees or gibbons? It was in the Congo, okay? Back during their civil wars that they had, they actually liked to hunt for bushmeat, right? As a way of feeding the troops. Now, they started hunting these monkeys, or these apes, and they actually went nocturnal as a response. And any time that they actually heard anything or smelled anything human, they were gone. And it took years and years and years for researchers to actually make contact with these monkeys once again. And whenever they did, they still have some beef. You know, they really don't like humans like that.
Yeah, I've seen people cite that before. Is like I've always found very interesting how the chimps, I think it was chimps in the Congo, would like suddenly become nocturnal too, like whether it's for food or for avoiding people.
I would definitely say that would probably be the reason why a Bigfoot would go nocturnal. It would really seem like, to me personally, if there was a situation where there were two competing hominid species or even great apes, right? And there was an existential crisis between the two of them, it would make more sense for one of them to go nocturnal because we went diurnal, right? Like, that's always been a hallmark of our species, is that we're a daytime ape. So it would kind of leave room for an equally intelligent animal to fill the same niche just at night. To me, that backs up some things that we've got here already established within the Bigfoot community. Not just that Bigfoot itself is nocturnal, but there are reasons behind why such an animal would want to be nocturnal. And that there's already a correlation between that behavior and what we've already got in primatology. So, with that, let's go ahead and knock out the next one. So, I was kind of surprised by this, because if I'm correct, this kind of lines up with my encounters that I had back when I was a child, because I have a hard time really remembering what month it was, but I do remember it being around the fall. And it seems as though Sasquatch activity really kicks up during that time of year.
So looking at the months of each sighting, October by far has the most, which is kind of interesting because, of course, the most famous piece of Bigfoot evidence, the Patterson-Gimlin film, was also filmed in October. But at the same time, October's like when a lot of people go deer hunting, so I think that's kind of the main reason that October has so many sightings. I actually feel like most of these time periods correlate more with like the times of year that people spend the most time outdoors. So like January has the least amount of sightings, and obviously there's going to be very few people outside in January when it's at its coldest. But then you get to summer, and that's when sightings increase, and that's when the weather's a lot better. So I think it's kind of something like that, where maybe they're active year round. Actually, they're not like migratory, or, but I'm sure they do like go to certain areas at certain times to like take advantage of like deer or something. So that is pretty interesting looking at that.
I'm kind of curious if there's if there was potentially any singular specimen that was actually accidentally tracked by your database, where like say they started around the Newcastle area hypothetically, right? And this a similar size, similar looking individual was reported over multiple days making its way say to Richmond or into that area or something hypothetical like that. I think that that would kind of help support or debunk the idea of Indiana being a migratory path because that has been brought up in the past.
Yeah, one thing that's worth mentioning. So there was actually a sighting that was probably about 15 miles away from the sighting I had in Batoka Lake, and this is at a place called Turkey Fork in Crawford County. So the person described something very similar to what I saw. So 8 foot tall and black hair color. Also, it was during crepuscular hours as well. So I'm kind of wondering if that's the same individual being spotted over a 5 year time gap. So it kind of seems like it's possible that they do, in fact, stay in the same areas for long periods of time if the areas like have enough food and water availability.
See, that would back up what we already know about great apes, right? Where they have a potential area where they roam, you know, but they have a home territory where the resources are good enough for them to stay. And I would definitely say Hoosier National Forest and Patoka Lake would be in that category. I would also say Monroe would be in that category. But, like, it really blows my mind due to the density of people in that part of Indiana that you have as much Bigfoot activity as you do. Because you would almost think that they would kind of stay more towards the Spencer area rather than be all the way closer to Bloomington Monroe Lake. You know what I mean? Now, there was one park I remember growing up as a kid that kind of stands out to me as Bigfoot territory, and that's McCormick's Creek State Park. Now, I don't know if there was any sightings particularly from that area, but that's an area kind of close to that population center that I would consider good habitat. But you're right, there's a lot of that I would consider rough, you know? Let's get into what I consider to be some of the most interesting stuff in this whole thing. Let's look into the reports per decade because there's something going on here that I want to kind of allude to in a bigger project, okay? So, when you look at the frequency of Bigfoot reports per decade, what do we got exactly?
So there's like a noticeable gap in between the 1890s and the 1930s where there's just like no sightings whatsoever. And then after the 1930s, they start picking up again until you get to the 1970s and they really start increasing. I've theorized that this correlates with the extinction of deer in Indiana. So deer went extinct in, I think it's believed to be 1893 in Indiana, or they became extirpated. That's the professional term for it. Then they were brought back in 1934. And that like pretty much correlates directly with the disappearance of Sasquatch in Indiana. It's a little different. So like it was in 1933 whenever the first reports began to come back, and then it was in the 1898 when the reports really ended. But still, it does correlate quite well with the sightings, and I really haven't seen any like sightings at all in that time period between the 1930s and 1900s. So it's pretty weird how there's just zero information there.
What I want to bring up is that this really does establish something really crazy in Bigfoot, okay? something that the science guys will get into it, but maybe the regular Joes might have a hard time wrapping their head around. Okay, so the extirpation event, or essentially when an animal is extinct in an area but it's not actually extinct. This happened in Indiana around the late 1800s and into the 1930s, right? So this isn't just a solitary event in this state. This actually correlates with Ohio. And this is really interesting because if you've ever listened to a particular interview with the History Channel in Salt River State Park, I'll bring this up here, the park naturalist here, who's also a Bigfoot investigator, brings up the same point and has the same kind of data to back up his points, where he's saying the extirpation of food sources in Ohio led to a large part of like 30 to 40 years where Bigfoot was not seen in Ohio. And then whenever the deer started coming back, so did the Bigfoot. And now we've got the same thing happening here in Indiana, where you've got the same gap with the same reason happening at the same exact time. That's crazy. And the biggest thing that really blew my mind, and this is something that we brought up and we started looking into after we kind of had this information already lined up, is that any of the Bigfoot reports in Indiana that are kind of outliers here all happened along the border of the state, with the majority actually happening on the Kentucky border. Now, Kentucky never had a major extirpation of deer. We had bison go missing. We had cougar. We had a couple of different wolves go missing. But we had major food sources here in Kentucky the whole time. And Bigfoot never left. Like, the first time I think it was ever brought up here in Kentucky was Daniel Boone seeing or hearing of Yahoos during their expedition, which is really interesting too. But that has been the start of it, and it has went completely on until this day with no stop. But right across the Ohio River, where deer started to become extinct, the Bigfoot fled. And that is insanely interesting. And I think we're going to go ahead and make another video about that in the future, because we want to get a full picture of what's going on here. Because if this is true, this is even more evidence to the pile of Bigfoot being a flesh and blood animal, because it has to have food, and it is intelligent enough to understand that, yeah, I might be able to stay here and hoof it, but it's a lot easier to just follow the deer. So it did. And then as soon as the deer came back, the reaction was almost instant. That's something that denotes a level of intelligence. Like, to put it into a comparison, bear have just now started getting back into Indiana. It took them almost 50 years to figure out the deer are back. It took Bigfoot like 6, maybe. It's a crazy number to think about. But I think that's... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that, numbers-wise, the average distance between the 1930s and the 1960s from the Indiana border was actually just 17 miles. And also, there wasn't any like reports in the very middle of the state, like Morgan Monroe State Forest, until the 1970s. So this just like further backs up the theory that they were like kind of moving into the state in that time period. And it wasn't until the 70s that they really like reestablished themselves.
I think that's something that hopefully that gets everybody excited, because that adds to the pile of evidence that what we have here, it conforms with the laws of nature, which is, I mean, so insanely important when we're trying to convince people that whatever we're looking at is something that science can tangibly look at one day. Is that this thing is following patterns, the same patterns that other wildlife is following. And from that we can build more behavioral profiles and we can get even more information out of it. But I think that's where we're going to wrap it up for tonight. If you've liked anything in this discussion so far, go ahead and give us a like, comment, and subscribe. We've got Eric Quest over here. We're going to have a link to his channel. We're going to have him in the collaboration section. And this has been Jaster with the Southeast Bigfoot Research Organization. And you all have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.